All right, welcome to this week's Wednesday webinar, this month's Wednesday webinar. I'm Shannon Dill. I'm with Mid-Atlantic Women in Agriculture, part of University of Maryland Extension, as well as our other Extension colleagues and friends in the Mid-Atlantic region. Today we have Dr. Jared Miller. He's going to be talking to us about principles of agronomy. Very excited about that presentation. And you can see we have webinars. We have them the second and fourth Wednesday of each month at noon, and we have them scheduled through December. So check them out there at the blue link. You can see upcoming ones as well as archive webinars. We do want to thank our sponsors of the Mid-Atlantic Women in Ag program, as well as, again, all of our collaborators and partners that work with us. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation today over to Jared. If you have questions, please use the chat pod, and any comments that you might have, you can enter them in there. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through those.
All right, thanks, Shannon.
Looks good.
All right, make sure it advances. Good?
Yep.
All right. So my name is Jared Miller. I'm an extension agronomist at the University of Delaware, former ag agent at University of Maryland. And I want to speak about just some principles of agronomy. It is going to be an overview of all the types of, it's going to be a very general discussion of all the different things you'd have to think about or understand as an agronomist. And the more you know, the better agronomist you would be, but you can't be an expert in all of this. Agronomy, an agronomist is more of a generalist. It's maybe what you would call a jack of all trades. But we do have people that specialize in certain parts of agronomy. The agronomy definition that was given to me about 20 years ago was that it's the science and art of growing food, fuel, and fiber from plants. So the food is what you're probably used to thinking of. Over here on the left, we have some barley. We're used to thinking of the food part. The fiber you might not think of as an agronomic crop if you are from the mid-Atlantic, because we don't grow cotton here, but cotton is a plant down south that a lot of agronomists would be very familiar with from the southern region of the United States. And of course, fuel. A lot of things that we might grow as grasses or plants for feed, their biomass can also be used to produce fuel. So all of these different things can be considered under agronomy. The science part of agronomy is easy to discuss because that's what I do as a university employee. We have university research and extension, so you can see us doing different planting trials and different fertility trials. So the science behind agronomy is to increase plant production sustainably and economically sustainably. We have university research, we have federal research. So the federal government has the Agricultural Research Service. If you've never heard of it, it's the federal branch that has funding to do research, and we often work together with them, but they'll do a certain level of research. And then, of course, all the companies and corporations out there who are doing plant breeding and creating new herbicides and pesticides for us to use, they also do a lot of their own research. So the science part is easy to discuss. The art part, as it was explained to me 20 years ago, the easiest way to think about the art was they would explain it as, you know how to turn that key in the tractor to get it started versus someone else who steps in there. It's like me walking in the door to our building this morning. It's a worn out key, and you have to know how to hold that key just right. And that's what they would describe as the art side. But now that it's 20 years on, I understand that art actually means experience. It's the experience of working in the field. So what a university can give you and what webinars can give you is they can give you the science and they can give you an overview, but they can't give you the experience of being an agronomist. Working in this every day gives you the details. It gives you the experience that you can walk out in this field and you might not be measuring something specifically. You won't be doing a scientific analysis, but you can look out there and your brain starts to feed you all this information and you take an educated guess from your experience. So it's the everyday practice in agriculture, and books and webinars can't catch it all. There's things that you can't explain to people. It's if you've ever given somebody instructions and they haven't been able to follow them because you forgot to explain things that just pop up in your head that you just understand, that's the art in life. It's the experience. So A 4-year college degree can teach you agronomy, but 20 years of experience will beat it because they will know very specific things and they've worked with it for so long. So when choosing agronomic crops, if you look up the definition of agronomy, say about 30 years ago, if you went to a land-grant college, you might have gone to study in an agronomy department, but the word fell out of favor. Departments often keep the same classes and the same professors, but they relabel themselves to attract the next generation of students. That's when you started seeing environmental science show up in the 90s, and now you're seeing sustainable crop production show up. They don't create 20 new classes. They create 1 or 2, and then they mix in some old classes. So agronomy was a very popular term. Amongst crop consultants and universities, we still use the term agronomy, but it's not as well known as it used to be. If you look it up on the internet, you might see people discuss horticulture as agronomy. But the more traditional agronomy is going to be field crops, grains and cereals, legumes, pasture and hay, fiber, sugar crops, and root and tuber are more traditional. So there's no real rule. You could switch back and forth. Anybody that's working with vegetable crops, fruits and nuts, ornamental, everything we're going to discuss in this presentation, from fertility to soil type to how deep you plant your seeds, it's all the same, but it's applied to different crops. And there's just different management that goes on with horticulture that you don't have to worry about as much with agronomy. There's different types of ways to look at it. So when we talk about agronomy, most people that call themselves agronomists are working with these crops over here, and they're going to vary where you are in the world and in the country. So grains and cereals, what we're calling grains and cereals, in bold there is what we typically have in the Mid-Atlantic. So you won't see soybeans on this list because soybean might be a grain, but it's a legume. So we'll get to that in a minute. But grains that we typically grow in the Mid-Atlantic are corn, small grains like wheat and barley, and then sorghum. If you have a sandier soil, you can see sorghum over here on the right. We do grow sorghum in the region because it works well in our drought-prone sandy soils that don't have irrigation. But all of these others, rice, millet, oats, rye, buckwheat, and even quinoa, are all grains and cereals that could be grown in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, depending on what works best in your region. Cereals are grasses. Corn is a grass. Same thing as wheat and barley. They're just different grasses. And the grain is going to be the edible portion. In a minute, we'll also talk about hays and pasture. So a lot of these grasses, you could grow corn for a grass, but it's more valuable as a grain, obviously. So grains and cereals are annual plants. So you plant the seed, you harvest the grain, and then you have to plant the seed again next year. They're not perennials. Besides, there's one called Kernza that they're trying to popularize to be a more permanent plant. And maintain, like, say, a no-till system where you have these roots growing in the soil. A lot of that work's being done out in the Midwest. Summer warm season, the C4 plants, if you remember that. So warm season plants, corn, pearl millet, and sorghum. You plant corn April or May. It grows very well in our warm temperatures, and then it dries down and senesces later in the summer. You plant cool season things like grass, barley, oats, rice, rye, and wheat. There's winter or spring varieties, but no matter what, most of their growth is in the spring or the cooler season. They have their grains early in the summer, and then they're done. So grasses can be cooler, warm season. Same thing we talk about pastures. You can have cool and warm season pasture grasses. But these grains are all a source of carbohydrates, so that's what we're growing them for. So you end up seeing with these crops, there's a lot of overlap where we can place them. So legumes can be used as cover crops. They can be used in pastures, but when we use them to grow for grains, the word that had been used, just like agronomy in the past, is not as popular now, was pulses. So pulses was probably used a lot more in the past than it is now. But soybean is a legume. We grow it for its grains. Same thing with chickpeas and field peas, peanuts and field beans. All of those would be considered pulses, but they're also a legume. And a legume is a plant that can fix its own nitrogen. And it does this by working with bacteria in the soil. And the bacteria pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and something that corn and other grasses don't do very easily. They might be able to work with some microbes. People are trying to work on that. There is an energy trade-off in doing this, but every single thing we call legume is something that will help fix its own nitrogen, so you shouldn't have to fertilize with nitrogen. Because a legume can fix its own nitrogen, they're often a good source of protein. Protein's made up of nitrogen. So we use soybeans as a protein source, and chickpeas and field peas especially. This is why vegetarians with tofu and chickpeas, this is where they would get their protein from, because that's what legumes would be good at. This is where we start to cross over in some of these crops, because a forage, if you think about when we talk about hunter-gatherers that would go out and forage for berries, it's the same thing when we talk about forages in terms of grasses and hays. Typically, this pasture on the left, you would have animals walking across it, and they're going to be foraging for grasses or foraging for their food. So that's where that term would come from. But we would have both grasses and legumes. So before we mentioned that corn's a grass. So you could forage corn. Typically, the time when people forage corn is if they had a drought and they have a failed crop, and then they say, well, I can save it because I have some cattle, and they send them out to feed on it. That's about the only time I've seen people feed on corn, because it's much more valuable for its grain. The same thing with legumes. Because you can get, we'll talk about oil seeds with soybeans, you can get the grain or the oil out of soybeans. You're not really going to forage a soybean versus a clover as a legume. But a lot of these crops can cross over into different categories, but we still separate them out by what's the best value economically, energy and nutrient wise. So grasses and legumes can be grown as either pasture or hay. So on the left here, we would have animals grazing the pasture, but you can always mow it and bale it up and store it for winter, and that's what we call hay. But hay would be included with forages because you're baling it for the animals. So grasses mentioned earlier, could be foraged. You can forage any of them, but more than likely, the ones that we forage typically have smaller seed heads, like timothy and fescue and orchard grass. So it's not going to be something that's very valuable for its grain, but it still produces this grass that they can feed on and get energy and food from. And they can be perennial. We can leave this pasture here year round. So in terms of soil health and soil quality, having a pasture is going to be better. And it's why you typically see on these rolling hills like this to help prevent erosion. A method for managing different grain crops and forages is silage. So silage is actually a way of harvesting the crop. So here they're chopping up the whole corn plant. So it's going to have the corn grain and all of the tissue. And the same thing with hay here. If you wrap these up in plastic like you're doing with hay, or you cover this up so that it doesn't have a lot of oxygen and it goes anaerobic, the bacteria help break it down. They kind of ferment it. You're not trying to create alcohol. It can. You're not trying to create alcohol as much as you're trying to break down the material so it's easier for animals to eat. So you can chop corn, you can chop hay. Any of those things we've mentioned previously could be turned into silage, but it's more of a harvest method than it is a specific crop. Here again, legumes cross over into different categories. So we can grow soybean for the protein, but soybean also is considered an oil seed. So we can use it for, say, biodiesel. If you've ever heard of biodiesel, soybean can be used for biodiesel. This is a field of rapeseed right here in front of you. Canola is rapeseed. It's the same plant. It's just been renamed. Rapeseed has a very tarticidic and possibly toxic part in the oil. Rapeseed oil itself is used in industry. It was bred into canola so we could use it as canola oil, and it was more palatable for human consumption. But sunflowers, peanuts, cottonseed, all of these can be used as oil seeds. And again, you see that soybean, the legumes, they can be pasture, hay, they can be seeds, they can be oil seeds. So they have a lot of different uses under legumes. And then fiber, on the left here is cotton fields from South Carolina. Don't have, Virginia is the closest cotton that I know of that we have in the region. So fiber is an agronomic plant, and you'll have a lot of expertise down south of here about how to grow this agronomically and how to fit in rotations, and it's going to be a little different. What we do have starting up in this region, and University of Maryland has a good program looking at hemp. This is a local hemp plant, not research hemp plant, but a local farmer's plant that possibly has a nutrient deficiency. So hemp can also be used as fiber. So this is something that we might end up growing in the region to use for fiber. And then sugar, not something we do up here. This is obviously some research plots of sugarcane, but this is down in Florida. You see by the palm tree. So it's tropical and subtropical. Growing this for its sugar. North of here, maybe North Dakota, South Dakota, you could use sugar beets. So they could show sugar beets, but not something we're going to have a lot of familiarity with in the Mid-Atlantic. Root and tuber we do have. Former Maryland Extension agent Sudeep here. in Dorchester County, possibly pulling up some potatoes. So beets, potatoes, carrots, turnips, radishes. While these could be worked on within horticulture, agronomy does reach over and work with these crops, particularly with potatoes. And then tobacco. So Southern Maryland, I don't know how much tobacco they have left, but tobacco is growing, at least in Maryland, and somewhat in the Mid-Atlantic region, maybe up into West Virginia, some too. I went to school in Kentucky, so it's a little more familiar with the research they were doing there, and going beyond just using it for smoking, but also as growing vaccines in it. That you can grow these vaccines in tobacco. I don't know how they do it. I just know that they do it. So tobacco is another crop that in certain parts of the country you would have agronomic expertise in, not necessarily as much here. And then cover crops. So you can see we talk about crops like grains are a certain crop, but all of them can overlap in so many ways. And same thing with cover crops. Maybe some of these crops aren't great for certain uses, but they can be used as a cover during the growing season. So when I grew up in Maryland in the 80s, we'll talk about double cropping in a second, but the wheat that we would grow, the winter wheat that we would grow, because it was on our hillsides and would prevent erosion, we called it a cover crop back then. And as interest has grown in using these for their environmental benefits to the land, we've included a lot more cover crops in our management, and we're paying people to put out cover crops versus just using it as a grain crop. But they can be used to prevent erosion. They can be used to add nitrogen to the soil. But none of this is actually new. This is a book chapter from 1909. Before we had commercial nitrogen, if you didn't have animal manure, you had to have nitrogen from somewhere, and legumes can only fix so much. So you can use legumes to add nitrogen to your soil, but you're not going to add enough to maximize your yield of corn. You just can't do it. If you're trying to get 200 bushels of corn, you're not going to get 200 pounds of N out of a legume. But they still, back then, they were getting 20 to 30 bushels of corn. So perhaps you could do that with a legume. And here you can see us planting right into some cover crops. But all of this was known. They knew there were nitrogen collectors, which would be like rye. Why do we plant rye over the winter? To pull nitrogen out of the soil so it doesn't go into the Chesapeake Bay. But then you can also plant clovers or mix with clover and grasses to add nitrogen to the crop. So we can use cover crops for a lot of different methods. All these crops can be used for that. Once you've thought about what crop you might want to grow, or you look at all these different crops, you have to think about your growing season. So we talked about, we're not going to grow sugar up here. It's a tropical plant, so it's not going to work very well. So you do have to understand what your growing season is. If you've ever bought plants and looked at whether you're in zone 6 or 7 or any of those, you know that some things aren't going to survive over the winter. Some things can't tolerate heat. We're in a very bad area for grasses and forages because we're right in the middle of where cool season and warm season grasses do well. So fescue is a cool season grass, but it's drought tolerant, but it also causes toxicity, possibly to beef cattle and horses. So we don't have great options for grasses in our growing season, but we do have good options for grain crop rotations. So you want to choose a crop that grows well in your region, and this is going to be based on your growing season and your climate. But it's also going to depend on your market. So sometimes people come in and they want to change agriculture or give people more diversity of crops. But if no one is going to buy the crop locally and the cost of shipping it somewhere else makes it cost prohibitive, you have to go with what the current market is. And in the Mid-Atlantic, with a lot of poultry, the grain crops do very well. So in terms of thinking about growing season, soybeans are a really good crop to think about. How are you going to look at your growing season in your region, and how are you going to fit a crop that you might want to grow into that growing season? And soybeans have a wide range in their growing season. And we've grouped them from the double zeros all the way down to group 8, I guess here in purple, which you can't see. So higher numbers have a longer growing season before they flower. So up north, they're going to grow a shorter season bean because they have shorter summers. But down south, you can grow a longer season bean. And at Delaware, the recommendation that we typically have for our soils and climate has been about a 4-2. So people plant what we call a late 3 here, which does well in southern Pennsylvania, a late 3 all the way up to late 4s. And we've tested all those out, and the same thing in Maryland. So you can see how this group 4 moves across here, and it's following climate. So whatever the climate is in your region is the soybean that you're going to choose to grow, how long its growing season in. And you can always play with that in different rotations. Same thing with small grains. If you've only ever worked with small grains in the mid-Atlantic, you might not know much about spring wheat varieties, and I definitely don't. We've never had to plant them here. But because our winters are fairly mild, they might seem cold to you, but if you go up to more northern climates, winter wheat and rye won't make it through the winter up there. It's just too cold. The freeze will end up killing it. So it's better for them to plant wheat in the spring. So they'll plant their wheat in the spring, but the benefit here on the left, this is probably about mid-March, right here, late February to mid-March. You can see how we already have all this growth. If you had to plant a spring wheat and you planted it in April when soils were getting warm enough to warm up and help it germinate, look how far behind you're going to be. So you get higher yields off being able to plant winter wheat. And then you'll see we can plant soybean behind it. So winter's planted in the fall, it goes into hibernation, it takes off again in the spring. So we do have benefits in the mid-Atlantic and further south of here that you can include this in your rotations. So northern regions are going to grow spring wheat. So these are the kind of things where you can be an agronomist, but you're still going to specialize or understand what's going on in your region a little better. Once you've looked at these crops and these different crops you could possibly grow, then you have to start thinking about rotations. Are you going to plant the same crop every year? Which is definitely frowned upon because of things like building up disease cycles, which is what happens when you have the same crop growing year after year. The insect populations can build up in that field. The pathogens can build up in that field. So it's good to rotate out crops. When there's high value for a crop, say soybeans, let's say for whatever reason, soybeans were half their value right now, but corn stayed high. It'd be hard to convince farmers not to grow corn year after year if they can make money on it, even with disease cycles. So in the past, when, say, cotton was so high in price, that's why it was planted year after year until it really broke down the quality of those soils because the crop was so valuable at the time versus rotating in and out. So continuous cropping is when you plant a crop more than 2 years. So 2 years of corn will be fine. By the time you hit the third year is usually when you start seeing some declines in yield. And sometimes there's reasons for people to do it, economic reasons for them to do it. Crop rotations can be anything. It's just 1 year you plant one crop, the next you plant another. So it can be as simple as full season corn, full season soybean, and taking that field back and forth year after year. Or say if you have a dairy farm, you might do 3 years of alfalfa, then 1 year corn and 1 year soybean. So that's a 5-year rotation. So rotations can change. Decisions, as if you work in research and you're working with farmers, they might change up on you 1 week before what they're going to plant, depending on the market, the field conditions, what they have access to. But rotations are great at breaking disease cycles, legumes adding nutrients to soil, helping weed controls. Specifically, if we're talking about things like Palmer amaranth, you want to have corn in that cycle because we don't have a whole lot of great herbicide options in soybeans versus corn for controlling palmer. So you can rotate crops in for weed control. And then the economics of it, having different crops in the rotation helps you spread out and hedge what's going on that year. Monocultures versus polycultures, we don't always discuss this a lot in extension because we typically work a lot with monocultures, which is where you grow one crop in a field during the growing season. So just having corn in the field at the time. And then polycultures are growing more than one crop during the growing season. So the example people like to use a lot is the Native American one where you had squash, beans, and corn in the same field, but that's really hard to pull off in modern ag in one field if you're also trying to use herbicides or weed control and you have a 1,000-acre field to try to pull some of this off versus a monoculture, which is easy to manage, harvest-wise, planting-wise, you know how to manage it. One thing that we could consider a polyculture, it could only be 2 crops, but having clover and a grass together in a pasture could be, for forages, could be a polyculture in our region. Polycultures are probably better for smaller farming than they are for large farm fields. Within that, you might see some popularity growing, bringing back some of these ideas in terms of intercropping and relay cropping. So intercropping would definitely be a polyculture. It's planting 2 crops at the same time in the same field. So here you might skip some rows and plant soybeans between them. And I'll show you kind of strip cropping in there. How wide that is, you got to think about harvesting, right? If you planted corn one row and soybean the next, how are you going to harvest that? It becomes difficult depending on the crop you're looking at. Relay cropping, which is growing in popularity somewhat out in the Midwest, is where one crop starts development and another's planted later. So what you have right in here, let's say you skip this wheat row or you make it twin wheat rows down here, and sometime in the spring, you plant beans down in here. And so the beans are growing after the wheat. You harvest the wheat in June, and then the beans can take over the field. So it's like relay. You're passing the baton to the next crop. And so by doing that, you've given beans a head start. Just like we talked about giving having winter wheat that has a head start. You've given beans a head start versus planting them after the wheat is harvested, which is the double crop system we'll talk about right here. So the closest thing that I know of to intercropping that we might have is because of some of our steeper hillsides, we'll do strip cropping. So a real, what I have seen people, what they're talking about with a polyculture is maybe one full planter pass of corn that you can harvest with a combine, and then one planter pass of beans. That would be one of the smallest things that might work here is whatever a combine pass could get. But we do have strip cropping here that's going to help us prevent erosion along this slope. And it also gives you multiple crops that you can harvest that year. If the market's different on each one, it gives you those economic options. If this were Delmarva, where I'm at, this field is a field this large is just easier to manage under one crop. But there are benefits in terms of erosion control and having multiple crops across these fields and these small acres to plant. Double cropping, so you can see here we had some wheat in this field and we have soybeans in it. These soybeans were planted after the wheat was harvested. So that's 2 crops in 1 year, which can be done because remember with those beans, there's different growing season lengths and beans are more adaptive. They can they respond to light conditions and when they turn to flowering. So you won't get as high of a yield off of double crop beans, but you can put another crop in there. Remember, with relay cropping, if these beans are planted here as the wheat's still growing, they have a head start versus planting your beans in July. Still going to yield off them, but not quite as high. So even within rotations and how you're going to set up your field, you still then have to make planting decisions. And so right here, you've got, well, we have a soybean project. We have 30-inch spaced out rows and 15-inch rows. So row spacing is related to optimizing plant spacing. How close can we get plants together that they can still get access to nutrients and water? And also shading out weeds. You see these 30-inch rows here aren't closing up as early as the 15. And as soon as you can close that canopy, you can start to shade out weeds and need less herbicides. You can save money that way. But some crops do well very close, like wheat and barley, and other crops need a little more space. We typically plant corn in 30-inch rows. Population is the same idea as row spacing, and they typically go hand in hand. If you think about a field, if you planted one soybean plant in there, that's not taking advantage of all the water holding and nutrient holding that field has, but there's a maximum that field can tolerate. Well, not tolerate, there's a maximum that field can grow to give you your best yield. Eventually you plant too many plants and you've wasted money in your seeds, and you might even reduce yield in that case if you have too many plants out there. So we have to optimize our row spacing, how far apart the plants are, and then the population. And the research is always being done and changing. We have new hybrids. As the climate changes, we might have to adapt some of this. And then planting depth is more straightforward. Larger seeds have more energy, so they can push through deeper in the soil. So corn, you can plant 1.5 inches, 2 inches. But when you look at a lot of those grasses, they might say 1/4 inch, because if you look at the grass seed, you buy grass seed for your lawn, you've seen it's a tiny seed. It's got to push through all that soil. So typically shallower depths for seeds, and you have to make sure you keep up with all of that. So we've talked about crops. We've talked about rotations. You see, we're going to keep going with all this knowledge you have to be a generally good agronomist. Then we have to discuss tillage. Once you start planting, well, then it's like, what are you going to plant into? Are you going to plant in a high residue over here? Are you going to use some kind of disturbance in tillage? Tillage is great at breaking up the soil and providing a very soft seed bed for those seeds to push through. It's great at that. But it also, if you come out to our research farm, you'll see tilled farms that have water ponded on top after heavy rain, and the no-till drains through here. And it's a trade-off of what's the best management to control weeds, to work the field, the soil type, the texture, and it's decision field by field. Sometimes people try to say all tillage is bad, but sometimes people find that it's necessary for their farms. So you have to understand these different types of tillage. Once we get into soils and tillage, you have to start thinking about soil types. Those populations we talked about, if you have a soil that grows, it produces low yields because it has low water holding capacity, like this Bojack 2, this is down in Virginia, you're not going to want to plant as high of a population because that all those corn plants are going to be competing for less water versus maybe this Wickham, which you could plant a higher population. And you can see from this image here how well the crop growth follows these soil types. This low water holding is very important. It's a big thing about soil. Fertility, you can add water, you can add through irrigation, but if you don't have it, this is when you start thinking about how does that population work when I have a poorly producing soil. When it comes to soil fertility, you can't cover this very well in one lecture or one slide, but that's all we're going to do is one slide. There are 17 essential nutrients. So as complex as this has gotten so far, then when you add in the fertility needs of these crops, and every soil can hold a different amount of nutrients or might have a different amount of nutrients in it, and then there's 17 of them you got to keep track of, it gets very difficult to understand fertility in a soil. The easiest way as a beginner to understand soil fertility is to understand texture. Clay soils will hold more water and more nutrients. Sandy soils will hold the least. That is the most straightforward, easiest way I can say it, and it still will have a lot of play in it. You can still grow a high quality yielding crop on a sandy soil, but the management takes a lot more. So you have to understand soil fertility as an agronomist. And once you understand what nutrients you need, then you have to think about, well, how am I going to add them? And then we get into legumes and organic matter and your parent material. So what's in your soil already? Is it going to provide some of the nutrients itself? And it will. That's why you take a soil test. So what's here, what can be recycled, what's your parent material going to provide? And every soil is different. Some soils have no zinc, some soils have plenty of zinc. Same thing as once you decide to fertilize, are you going to use commercial? Are you going to use liquid? Are you going to use dry? What's its availability? How is it going to react with the soil? Is it going to burn the crop? When do you apply it? The same thing with all these organic, I call them organic waste. This is poultry litter, but you can use biosolids. You can use human waste. That's why I use the term waste in here. So commercial versus organic, and what's the nutrient availability of these? What's the cost? How do you apply them? What kind of equipment's going to apply them? It gets more complex as you get down this line. Choosing the crop was easy. Then you get into what nutrients you're going to choose, and do you understand equipment calibration and setup? You can always call experts. You can always look things up. But this is where the experience comes in as an agronomist. The more you work in the field, you can't know all this coming out of school no matter how much you read. You have to do it. And there's so many different conditions you might plant into. Tillage makes it easy. Planting into green crops is more difficult. You can see here, are you getting that depth? Are you getting the seed placement? Is the seed sitting on top? And the seeds will sit on top of this if you don't cut into it. So calibrating your equipment and setup, you have to make sure you calibrate it right. And this is what happens when you don't calibrate things very well. So we have an application out here that was done very poorly by someone who obviously didn't care very much or check their application rates. Here's the corn growth. You can see these streaks and they hold up. Here's this streak here. It's right over here. It holds up very well through the season. This affected yield. So understanding equipment and calibration as an agronomist, again, you can always call the experts. You call the engineers. You make sure you work on it. But you have to understand that. If you work in the Mid-Atlantic, then you probably have to understand something about irrigation. We do have irrigation, particularly on here in Delmarva. You can see how quickly these soybeans here dried down without additional water, and these beans are just starting to senesce down here. So what are your crop needs? Every crop's going to need a different amount of water. How much water does your soil hold? How much rainfall did you have? Are you going to use moisture sensors? Are you going to use irrigation scheduling? Again, we have irrigation specialists here that puts out information, but if you work as an agronomist in this region, you're probably going to have to know some of this. Precision agriculture isn't something that's, I would say, is required as an agronomist, especially in the Mid-Atlantic. We don't have quite as much of it used here as, say, out in the Midwest, but it's something you could add into your program. It's something you should have a minimum knowledge of, particularly when talking about yield limiting factors that might be in the field. You don't have to use precision ag technology like variable rate application of seeds and fertilizers without knowing where to take your soil samples. You can look at electrical conductivity maps and soil maps, elevation maps, and yield maps to kind of figure out what's going on in the field to increase yield. So your knowledge of precision ag can be very low to very high. And again, we have specialists in everything. Our research station have weed specialists and precision ag specialists and disease specialists. So you can count on people that have different various amounts of knowledge to pull this off. But think about if you're a farmer, and all farmers are agronomists. All grain crop farmers are definitely agronomists, and pasture farmers are definitely agronomists. You have to have knowledge, a certain amount of knowledge of any of this that you might work with. Now you've got your crop in the ground. You've done your tillage, you have your seeding rate, you have your fertility down. Now the crop's in, you have to follow it through the season. So then you have to know the growth stages of your crops. So a lot of them are split up into vegetative and reproductive. So here for corn, vegetative, 1, 2, 3 leaves. So this would be a V3 corn plant. And this is important because the instructions on herbicide application or split applying your nutrients are going to tell you apply your split applied nitrogen we put out at V4 to V8. So you have to know what stage you're at, and you have to be out there scouting and looking for it. And then you get into the reproductive stages, like when is my corn going to dry down? If you're going for silage, it has to be a little wetter. If you're waiting for it to dry down, being able to follow these reproductive stages in these crops, again, helps you know when you can and can't apply different pesticides, as well as how far out are we from when can I shut off my irrigation or when are we going to harvest. And then within in-season management, we get into abiotic versus biotic issues that might decrease your plant yield. So the easiest one to discuss, to understand abiotic, I'll cover biotic first. A disease like this is biological. This is powdery mildew. So a fungus, a bacteria, or a virus that infects your plant is going to be biotic. An insect is going to be biotic. Something that's living versus something that's non-living, freeze damage, pesticide drift here, all these little spots on the plant, and even nutrients, because plants take up nutrients as mineral forms. So you might have microbes that aren't breaking down your organic matter, but if you've added commercial N, it's a mineral form, that's an abiotic issue. So once you get through all this knowledge of plants, then once the plant's growing, you have to start recognizing all these issues. And again, you can study books, you can go through webinars, but the only way to really learn this is year after year, you go out and you start picking up and your brain starts remembering all these different things that can happen out there. And still, you have to go back and talk to people that are experts in it. You can't be an expert in all of it. Within nutrients is one of the most important, because if you've applied your fertilizer and taken your soil test, you still have to make sure that you did the right thing. You have to scout your field for issues. You have to know how to take tissue samples, because nutrients are in different parts of the plant at different times. Once your plant starts to grow the grain, nutrients are pulled out of the plant tissue into the grain. You have to understand, when you look at these tissue tests, what stage am I at? What part of the plant did I take? And what concentration, this critical concentration, should it be in the plant at that time? So again, it's an additional amount of knowledge you have to have. And then with weeds. So weeds is going to be a more biotic issue. Weeds compete for light. They can shade out your plants. You can see the sorghum, very hard for us to control weeds sometimes at sorghum. They compete for water and they compete for nutrients. So they're going to reduce your yield. Because they're going to limit your production, they're going to control them. So you're probably going to use herbicide or you're going to use tillage. No, either one of those is going to cost money. So it's going to increase your costs. It's going to cut into your profits having to control weeds. So they can be chemically or mechanically removed, but either one of these is going to cost time and money to control weeds in your field. Then you have diseases, fungal, bacterial, or viruses. So you can see that we have some stalk rot here in corn. We have some barley yellow dwarf virus here in this wheat leaf. So you can have fungal issues, bacterial issues, or viruses. They're going to infect your plants. They're going to reduce yield or kill the plant. And where you'll see diseases, insects, and weeds all overlap is if you only have one leaf that looks like this, well, you're not going to try to correct it. There are what we talk about as in this economic threshold. When is the insect population high enough that it's going to reduce yield, that it makes it cost effective to try to reduce that yield limiting factor? Nematodes are poor pathologists, have to deal with fungi, bacteria, and viruses, but they often are thrown nematodes as well, even though they're parasites, because nobody else wants them. So they often end up having to work with nematodes as well. With all these things with diseases, it requires a pathogen, a host, and the right environment. They have this triangle that they use, because if you don't have the pathogen, which across the country we have different types of pathogens that don't necessarily happen here. If you don't have the pathogen, you won't have infection. If you don't plant the crop, the host, you won't have infection. If you don't have a wet spring or wet summer, you're not as likely to have fungal issues. So you have to have all of these to really have a disease issue, and then you have to make sure it's actually an economic problem. Insects are a little more obvious, the damage they can cause. They can eat on your leaves, and they love you. You always see your soybean leaves are torn up and eaten and bit on, but is it high enough that you need to control it? They're going to eat leaves. That's your photosynthesis. That's feeding the crop and making your grain. So you definitely don't want them to defoliate your plant. They can feed on roots, so you're not going to be able to take up nutrients and water. And they're definitely, it happens a lot this time of year. You can see that nice corn here, and then you open it up, and somebody's gotten in there and chewed it up pretty good, and they'll end up reducing your yield somewhat and possibly making it more susceptible to disease. Insects can carry and transmit diseases. And same thing, we can chemically, mechanically, biologically, or culturally control them. So you can see when we talk about weeds, disease, and insects, you have to be able to recognize all these in the field and then know how to correct them, or know who to call that can do that for you. And then finally, we get to the end. You've made it all the way through the season, and harvesting seems easy. We send the combine out there and it harvests our grain, but you have calibration in the combine. You have equipment breakdowns. You have to make weather considerations. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, when hurricane season starts, all the way here and down south, same thing. When hurricanes are coming through, you might harvest that corn a little earlier than you wanted to. And the problem with that is moisture content. Because if you're going to store your grain and it's wet, it can mold, and then it's going to lose its value. And it can possibly have toxic elements to it, and you might not be able to sell it. So we want our grain to dry down naturally, because if you harvest it wet and have to pay to dry it, then that cuts into your profits. So we want our fields to dry down, but you have to watch the weather. Is my field going to be too wet to harvest? Is a hurricane coming? Is my corn going to lodge? Is it easier for me to get it out now and pay to dry it down? Moisture content's important because we have standard moistures for all our different crops that we're harvesting, and you have to remember and understand that when you're converting to the right yield you get out. If you're within precision ag, and even people that don't use variable rate application, almost everybody has a yield monitor. It's an easy thing to add to a combine. Have you calibrated that correctly? Because if you're going to use that yield map, and through the season, as the moisture of your crop changes, as it dries down more, you have to recalibrate the yield monitor, even though it takes some time to get several points and several different loads in the field, from wet parts of the field to dry parts of the field, to make sure that you have a good calibration so that your map actually is telling you what's going on. If you have storage, which is great if you're thinking economics, wait till you have that better price to sell. That's when it comes back into moisture content again. How are you going to store it? Where are you going to store it? How long are you going to store it? How much does it cost to dry it? And then even after you've harvested, you don't want to walk away from the field. Then you have to think about, are there post-harvest weeds that I need to control before they produce seeds? And there often are. Is there residue in the field that I want to break down now versus have it sitting out in the spring so that I can plant into an easier seed bed? Or am I going to put cover crops out there? So even after harvesting, there's additional types of things that we have to worry about. So within agronomy, I feel the same about talking about agronomy as I do when I talk about soils. There's a lot of very general knowledge you have to have. So if you're an agronomist, and let's say you work for a crop consulting firm and you're an agronomist, or you're a university agronomist, it can be very general, which is what I'm going to be at Delaware. We have 3 counties. We're not going to have specific skill sets, but we have weed specialists and disease specialists that can work. And they are agronomists because they have to understand planting rates. They might not be experts in all of it, but they have to understand some of that. You can have in Midwestern states where they have very large fields and a lot of agriculture, a lot of field crop agriculture, they'll have a corn specialist and a soybean specialist and a wheat specialist. So depending on where you're at, you can have these You can have these specialists, but if you're a farmer or you're a crop consultant, you're probably a generalist. And the more experience you have, the better you are at it, but you still know who to call and all of that. So within all this in agronomy, the reason it's important to understand some of it, because even if you work at, say, NRCS or FSA, you can still consider yourself to a certain degree an agronomist, because if you want to communicate with a farmer, if you want to communicate within extension or the NRCS and other consultants, being able to know, you don't have to specialize and memorize every seeding depth of every crop, but able to know that I need to understand that there's different populations we plant here, that there's different crop rotations. Having a generalist knowledge of agronomy makes you more valuable and makes people, I think, trust you more if you're within those fields. So it is an old term. It is a lot of different knowledge, and you shouldn't feel bad if you haven't memorized some of this, as long as you know someone out there who you can call. So that is a lot of information that you could have an entire course of in agronomy. If you have any additional questions about it, you can ask me. That is the most basic way that I can share and talk about the different things that we know in agronomy. And I will tell you that I am not an expert in all of that, because I have people that I can call and talk to, and I don't plan on being an expert in all of that. So I never feel bad if I don't know anything, but I do know some of all of that. And the more years I'm in this job, I think hopefully the better I get at it. So I'll take any questions if you have them.
Anybody have any questions for Jared? That was an excellent overview. That would be great for a beginning farmer program. Just looking on here to see. I don't see any questions, so we will be following up in about 24 hours with the recording as well as the slides. And if you have questions, you won't be able to unmute yourself. You'll need to type it in the chat pod or the Q&A pod. All right, I'm not seeing anything come through. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.